Welcome to this webinar on a holistic approach to managing segregation of duties. My name is Barun Kumar and I'm a director with Turnkey Singapore. Before I start this webinar, just a quick introduction. I have worked in SAP security and GRC space for more than 19 years. I have worked across industries and geographies, and I currently manage the Singapore practice of Turnkey Consulting. We are often approached by clients facing a lot of issues around segregation of duties. They have a lot of questions, they have a lot of challenges. This webinar is an attempt to address those challenges and questions. We are specifically going to talk about what is segregation of duties. We will then talk about a holistic framework to manage segregation of duties. Within that, we're going to talk about SoD rule set, SoD remediation strategy, as well as governance structure. A lot of smaller organizations struggle to enforce SoD requirements, and mitigation control is a topic that is going to be of good interest for them because we are going to talk about how mitigation controls can be used to address situations where due to manpower shortage or other business constraint, we are not able to address the SoD risks. We are also going to look at SoD risk in terms of how we go about cleaning and keeping it clean. Those are the two key stages in any SoD project, and we'll talk about how we go about these two phases inside the project. Let's get on with the webinar. Let's start off with what is segregation of duties. So SoD prevents the ability of an individual to perform two or more conflicting functions within a process or within a sub-process without the involvement of other users. Now, why we are worried about SoD is that if a person has got that combination of conflicting functions, they might be able to misuse it either for some fraudulent transaction or for doing something that they should not be doing. Let's take an example of this user who has got access to two different functions. One is to open and close posting period. The other is to post journal entries. As we can see within SAP, these are reflected in terms of transaction codes and authorizations. But in any typical SAP environment, this would be considered as an SoD risk. Now, the reason is that this can be misused. So let's understand what can go wrong if a user has this combination of functional access. So the user might be able to record a journal entry into a prior period which has already been closed by reopening that period. Now, this is a classical case of hiding a financial transaction by posting it into a previous period. So this is something which is considered fraudulent. This is something which should not be allowed. However, a user with both these functions, they can potentially do that, and that's the reason we consider this as a SoD risk and we try to prevent that. Okay, so having understood that, let's look at how we manage such SoD risks from a process perspective through a holistic framework. So this will consist of three aspects. The first one is having an SoD rule set. The second is a definition of SoD remediation strategy, and the third one is having a governance structure to manage the segregation of duties. These are the three components of a holistic SoD framework, and we are going to talk about each of them as we go along in this webinar. Let's start off with the SoD rule set. SoD rule set is essentially a rule book which consists of multiple SoD risks. Each of these SoD risks are formally defined, approved, and owned by the business stakeholders. Now, when we talk about the individual SoD risks, they have got two aspects to it, or two perspectives. One is the business perspective to it, the other is the technical. If I am a business user who do not understand the technical part of SAP, I would be most likely interested in the business definition, which simply tells me what is the business risk if I give this combination of access to a user. Technical definition, on the other hand, is meant for SAP and the SoD tools to understand who has got access to those combination of access, and this is typically defined in terms of transaction codes and authorization objects. Let's look at an example to understand this further. So this slide talks about a SoD rule set which is called global. It has got multiple risks. These are defined as risk A, B, C, D, E, and F. And if we look inside a risk, they all consist of at least two functions If you focus on risk B, we are talking about two functions as vendor master maintenance and vendor invoice processing. Now that is my business definition of the SoD risk. If we go to the transaction and authorization, vendor master can be processed or maintained using multiple transactions like XK01 and FK01, and there are underlying authorization objects, and those needs to be defined for each function, and that is the technical definition of the SoD risks. So if you want to visualize that, a business definition for an SoD rule set will consist of different SoD risks with a risk ID, a headline or a risk definition which tells us which are the two activities or 3 or 4 activities which is causing that SoD risk. And the risk description is typically a business-friendly description of the risk. So in this case, we are saying that if a person has access to posting period maintenance, which is the activity 1, and journal entry posting, which is the activity 2, then the user may record journal entries in prior posting period by reopening the closed periods. Now this is a definition, a description that we expect a typical business users to understand. Each of the risks are also rated as high, medium, low. It could be critical, important, not important, desired. So whatever is the rating mechanism, but we try to assign a rating just to understand the criticality of that risk and also to decide how a potential risk violation for that risk can be addressed. It is a good practice to assign a risk owner against each of the risks. We'll talk about the roles and responsibility, but a risk owner is essentially responsible to make sure that this particular risk is addressed in the organization. So if somebody is violating this particular risk, they are the person who will decide what happens with that access. Now, if we look at the technical definition, we are essentially saying that both the activities needs to have a defined transaction code and authorization, which is in terms of the SAP technical definition. So if we look at activity 1, posting period maintenance, it relates to multiple transaction codes and authorizations, which is basically the authorization object, field, and field values. So this is the technical definition. Now, if you look at from a role and roles and responsibility perspective, the business definition is defined and owned by the business stakeholders. The technical definition is provided by the SAP team or the security team, and it is owned by them. So that is the typical segregation. The business should be able to define and tell what are the business risks. Those are my business definition of the SoD risks, and the SAP team, the technical team, they should be able to take that and convert that into a technical language that SAP or the SoD tools understand. Now, once we have defined the SoD rule set, the next step is to define a remediation strategy. It basically determines how the SoD violations should be addressed. So when I request for an access and the check tells the security team that that access will result in a potential SoD risk violation, so I will be violating one of the SoD risks which have been defined, the remediation strategy tells the security team what they should be doing. There are different ways of addressing that. This example is based on SoD risk rating, wherein we are saying that if the SoD risk rating is high, there is no option but to remove the conflicting access. So we are talking about two functions, so either of those two functions need to be removed from the users. There is no way a user can have this combination. However, if the risk is rated as medium or low, then they should try to remove the access where it's possible, but if that is not possible, that can be accepted with certain mitigation control. For a medium rated risk, the mitigation control has to be approved not just by the risk owner but also by the CFO. However, the low rated SoD risk can be approved by the risk owner. Now this is just an example. Different organizations will have different risk appetite, different processes, and accordingly they can come out with their own SoD remediation strategy. But the key thing to remember is that this takes away the ambiguity in the process. Everyone knows what has to be done when they encounter an SoD risk violation. Now, if you look at SoD from a project perspective, a typical situation is that a client, a company notices either through an audit or through self-check that there are a lot of SoD risk violations, so they need to clean it up. Now, the first thing that needs to be done for cleaning up SoD is to develop the SoD rule set. We have talked about it. Then to have an SoD remediation strategy, which we have also talked about. Now, having that two things in place, we need, in a typical situation, an automated tool to analyze the SoD risk violation. As we have seen, there is a technical definition for the SoD rule set, which can goes into thousands and thousands of lines, and it is theoretically possible but practically not possible to do such checks on a manual basis. So it is highly recommended that we implement an SoD tool to analyze the SoD risk violations, and with that tool to conduct a SoD risk analysis. Now, once we know which are the users and which risk they are violating, we need to start cleaning up. The cleanup can either be removing the access which is causing the SoD violation. This is an ideal solution. This basically eliminates the SoD risk, but it is not always practical. If for whatever business constraint it is not possible to remove certain access, we try and define and assign the mitigation control. Now again, remember, this has to be aligned with the SoD remediation strategy. Now, this is a one-time get clean activity. This just makes sure that we have cleaned up the SoD risks within the users in my SAP environment. However, to keep it clean, that is to make sure that those SoD risk violations do not recur, we need to put in certain governance processes, and we are going to talk about those SoD governance processes subsequently. Also, just like analyzing the SoD risk, in terms of enforcing the SoD, also we need to implement automated tool. Again, doing it manually is theoretically possible but extremely difficult. So we talked about the mitigation control. Let's try to understand what is a mitigation control. It is an alternate way of addressing SoD risks where removing conflicting access is not possible. This is specifically useful for smaller organization, but even for a larger organization, you may have situations where due to the business process structure, you are not able to remove certain SoD risk violation from the user. In such situation, mitigation control is an option. Mitigation control typically either eliminates or reduces the SoD risks. These can be manual or automated. It could be preventive or detective. For example, a review of a report is typically a manual detective mitigation control, whereas let's say an PO approval is a preventive and automated control if it is enforced by the SAP system. So the key thing to remember is when we start using mitigation control, we should have a formal register to maintain the mitigation control. This should be a bucket list of all the possible mitigations against different SoD risks. It should also define who are the mitigation control owners. These are the people who are responsible to make sure that the mitigation control actually works. The mitigation control is not just a one-time assignment. The mitigated SoD risk should be reviewed on a periodic basis. There are two things. One is to ensure that the reason why we mitigated instead of removing the access still exists, and if the scenario has changed and it is possible to now remove certain access to address the SoD matrix, we should do that and not rely just on the mitigation control. The other aspect is to make sure that the mitigation control is still valid and still active. I mean, we might document a control, but if it has ceased to work operationally, there is no point relying on those mitigation controls. So mitigation control essentially is a alternative to removing the access from the user. If due to business constraints it is not possible to remove the conflicting access from the user, organizations can rely on mitigation controls instead. Now, the final component of the framework, the governance structure, there are different things that we need to do to make sure that the SoD framework survives and it is valid and current on an ongoing basis. The first aspect is the roles and responsibilities. We should have a clear definition of roles and responsibilities related to the SoD framework. This may include rule set owner, risk owner, mitigation control owners. We talked about some of their responsibilities in the previous slides, but essentially we need to formally define that as part of the SoD governance structure. We should also have a process for making changes to the SoD framework. So if we need to change the SoD rule set, there should be a clear-cut defined process for that. For example, if a SOD risk is no longer valid, we need to drop it. It should not be up to the risk owner to decide that. Maybe it should be defined, it should be approved by a senior management person or by a committee of people who are maybe a rule set owner. Also, if there's a big change in the environment, it could be a new SAP module, it could be a major change in the business process, there should be a review of the SOD rule set to see if that needs to be changed. So the framework, the governance structure should have processes to ensure that the SOD framework remains current. It doesn't become obsolete with time. Now finally, the key thing to keep the SAP environment free of SOD risk is to have SOD management procedures. Now there has to be certain preventive check. The basic is to check for every user access request whether that access request is going to result in an SOD risk, and if it does, it should be addressed using the remediation strategy. Also, if you are making any changes to the SAP roles or creating a new SAP role, it should be checked for SOD violation, not just in terms of an intra-role SOD risk violation, but also the impact of such changes to the users who already have access to that role. For example, I have a role, I add a new T code. Now all the users having access to those roles have got that new T code, and that could result in a new SOD risk violation for the user. So it's important to do a simulation and figure out how the role changes is impacting the users. Now, it's not always possible to prevent the SOD risks from happening. It could be either because of the gaps or the cracks in the processes. So we should have a detective process. It could be an annual SOD risk review to check if there are unmitigated SOD risk violation and address that through a structured process. Also, there should be a process for checking the ongoing validity of the mitigation controls. So together, these three parts, which is the SOD rule set, the remediation strategy, and the governance structure, will make sure that the SOD risks are cleaned up, so they are remediated, and they are kept clean on an ongoing basis. Now, finally, I would want to share some of the common challenges that we have seen in a typical SAP SOD project. The first one is related to the intra-role SOD risk violation. We often find roles which has got SOD risks within themselves. Now, every user with access to such role will have the SOD risk violation, and we cannot remove those risk violation without making changes to the role. So it is imperative that we ensure all the SAP roles are free of any SOD risk violation. Now, very related to that is the SAP role design. We often come across bad role designs wherein, for example, the same transaction codes are assigned to multiple roles. There are unrelated or cross-modular transaction inside a role. For example, a sales role has got a HR transaction, or an HR role has got a procurement transaction. Now what happens during a typical cleanup stage is such role design make it very, very difficult to remove access from a user without impacting something that they need to have access to. So bad SAP role design is not good for the SOD project. It is always a good idea to either clean up the role design or maybe do a role redesign together with the SOD project if there are a lot of SOD risks in the SAP setup. Now, missing process control is another aspect. If there aren't enough process controls in the business, it is not going to be possible to enforce SOD control. It's as simple as that. So the process structure should be conducive to implementing SOD controls. If not, we can go on with the SOD project, but we will not be able to implement it without the right process controls. Finally, lack of accountability. If the roles and responsibilities are not clearly defined, it is going to be very difficult to sustain and maintain the SOD free environment on an ongoing basis. It is important to define that clearly, assign those responsibilities, and make people accountable for their responsibilities. So these are the 4 key challenges I think is important that needs to be addressed for any SOD project. Finally, I'll just summarize this session, this webinar, and also talk about some of the key takeaways. So we have talked about what is a segregation of duties and how that can be managed in a holistic manner in a SAP environment. We talked about the SoD rule set, the remediation strategy, as well as the governance structure. Now, the key takeaways and the key things to remember is the involvement of the business stakeholders. Now, remember, the SoD project is not a technical project. It cannot be run by the SAP team or the security team. The business stakeholders have to be involved. They have to define the business risk and they have to drive the project. Now, in terms of roles and responsibility, there is a segregation. Business stakeholders are not expected to understand the technical details, so they can limit themselves to the business definition and taking the business decisions, and the technical part of the SoD should be assigned to the SAP security team. So it is very important that the roles and responsibilities are clearly defined and people are held accountable for that. Now, cleaning up SoD risks is like a sprint. We have a clearly defined timeline. We know what the problems are and we can address that. However, keeping it clean is a long haul. We need to have good processes to manage and maintain this SoD-free environment. So focus on putting in the right processes and right tools to ensure that the SoD risks are managed on an ongoing basis. Finally, automation is the key. It is really very hard to manage an SoD project and keep the SAP system free of SoD without an automated tool. There are lots of tools available. It includes tools from SAP like SAP GRC Access Control and also a lot of third-party tools, for example, ERP Maestro. It is important that we consider automation that makes it much easier to manage SoD on an ongoing basis. Thank you for attending this webinar. I hope this was useful. If you have any more questions around these areas, you can reach out to us. You can find the contact details on our website, www.turnkeyconsulting.com. Thank you very much.